I've actually been advised by people not to talk about protected characteristics because it comes at reputational risk.
How do we do that? What does it look like? And what are the benefits for children and young people?
It is a conversation that isn't happening. And I think it's worth saying, and I've never mentioned this publicly before, I want the best for care experienced people. If we don't talk about the risks and challenges, then we don't develop mitigations.
How do you imagine you are going to prevent those groups from discrimination?
Discrimination does happen. What does it actually mean, therefore, for the care experienced community to be protected? Welcome to Conversations That Care, the podcast brought to you by the Care Leaders. I'm Luke Rodgers, and joining me is Karylle Phillips. In episode 2, Protected Characteristics, A Balanced View. Okay.
I'm ready.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah, you're ready. So This podcast is obviously about protected characteristics, a topic that is so important for our sector. It's getting a lot of airtime, and there are councils now on this domino effect of making care experience a protected characteristic. Before we get into it, there are so many people with lived experience of care that are channeling their personal stories into this campaign. So I want to respect, I want to honour, I want to show gratitude to those people that are sharing those experiences. And that what this is now is it's two people coming together, both you and I, with care experience to talk about what protected characteristics means from our perspective. But I think that our perspective is quite unique in that we have got incredibly deep insights of care, both from our lived experience, but also from our professional experience, because you and I are quite unique in that we've actually worked in this space in such a professional way at all levels that we actually bring forth a perspective that is lived and professional experience. And I want us to sit in that space while we talk about protected characteristic. Can you help me understand a little bit about what a protected characteristic is?
Well, look, and most people will hear or have known the term or will say it. And it's becoming more of a term that's being used anyway in general, just to group together lots of different areas that people, lots of different parts of somebody's identity where they might face discrimination. And I think that's really key here because we're talking about protection from discrimination. That's the idea, but only on a legal basis, okay? We're not talking about protection every day when you're walking down the street or in day-to-day life. We're just talking about in particular spaces that people might frequent. We're talking about protection from discrimination because what we know is we've found that particular groups, even more so, are disproportionately impacted by discrimination. And so they're more likely to face discrimination in certain spaces, be that getting a job, be that going to education, be in whatever space they might frequent, they are more at risk of. And so those things include age, ethnicity, religion, gender, disability, etc. And so, so some of those protected characteristics sit underneath a piece of legislation known as the Equality Act in 2010. And the idea now is that within those groups, so within those areas that we just mentioned that are protected, that care experience as a theme or as a title or as a group would sit within that protection.
Okay.
And so that those people with care experience would then be protected from discrimination.
Yeah, but in law, so you're not actually protected from somebody on the street being discriminatory. You're not protected from, that kind of everyday public stigma, public narrative, which we know lots of care experienced people find challenging. When I was doing the research on what protected characteristics actually mean, there was two concepts that really came to my mind, which I wanted to share. And the two pieces of language that it used was significant discrimination, which was number one. And the second word that I read was evidence. So it was always about evidence and significant discrimination. Okay. Now, when I've looked at care experience, there is nowhere that I can find significant discrimination that is evidenced. So for me, it's if that is the criteria to making something a protected characteristic, how are we fulfilling that criteria? So the more I thought about it, I was like, well, what does the other protected characteristics look like if we were to think evidenced and, significant discrimination? We only need to look at like women's rights, when you were married as a woman up until very recently.
Not me, right?
Yeah.
Not me.
We won't go there. That's for another podcast. Essentially like the law for women, you can find very specific and dark pieces of legislation.
And areas of history outside of just the history of the lived experiences of being a woman at particular times and stages or in particular spaces were met with.
So what happened is that, women came together, they marched, they had this shared experience where quite rightly so, they were saying, right here, this very specific thing is discriminatory. And there were so many of these things that they could point out. So there's that. It wasn't until very recently, if you were black and you had to sit on a certain part of a bus, you had to get on and enter buildings in different entrances. Again, you're pointing there at discrimination, and it was illegal to be gay, again, until very recently. So when you look at the other protected characteristics, you can pinpoint quite clearly where the discrimination is and the impact of that discrimination. And the one key thing about all of them is that how it's changed is through the community coming together and everybody driving and championing this change. We do not have that with this campaign.
No,
we have a very, very small number of people campaigning for it. And where is everybody else in that conversation?
I've never been, other than sitting here with you now, I've never been invited to be a part of that discussion. There's almost this, dare I say, if I speak and it's not in alignment with what the current focus is, then I'm not heard. There doesn't seem to be a space for that collective community level consultation first that's driving it. And it's not to say that the driving force isn't considered by those who are driving it or those groups that are part of it a positive for whatever reason, right? But it's not a collective, inclusive viewpoint. At least it's certainly mine isn't involved. And I know lots of other people with lived care experience who aren't involved in that.
Yeah, and I think like the campaign language and what I've been sort of observing is what it is not is a let's talk about this recommendation that has been made from the care review. Bearing in mind, the care review hasn't gone because of all of this stuff that we've got evidence for, therefore making it a protected characteristic will solve it. The care review just made a recommendation. So for me, the second point from a recommendation is to do consultation, to say, okay, what are the risks? What are the benefits of this making it a protected characteristic? And how do we communicate on this specific topic about, with the community that it's going to impact? Because I don't think we're even clear on who's going to be protected.
Well, that's my question in terms of care experience. What are we talking about here? What are we talking about? Looked after children? Are we talking about care leavers? Or are we talking about both and anything in between? Because care experience can mean so many different things.
So I definitely think it's both of what you've mentioned. Where I'm unsure and where it has been unclear, but where I've obviously said I'm following this quite closely, is that I've heard on occasion it pop up where it's going to include foster carers in this space because they're by default linked to the care experience. And then it becomes a bit confusing then, because is it not then diluting the fact that actually the argument is that young people who have care experienced people are discriminated against. Oh, but we're also going to include foster carers. So then does it mean that we include social workers as well?
Well, that would have been my question.
Yeah, because for me, this is going to impact social workers' decision-making because they're going to have to make decisions now with the idea of, like, asking themselves the question, hey, am I discriminating? Have I got a bias?
My thing would also go back to, and it's not to suggest for 1 minute that all the changes that have happened for those that are protected under the Equality Act right now from discrimination, although I just want to point out, I'm very much aware that those people who are a protected characteristic, so to speak, might still, like myself, feel as though they still face discrimination in different spaces for different reasons, right? And so the Equality Act to date hasn't done anything for me in everyday life, but what it's done is it's done things beyond me. So it's that gender thing. It's that making sure women can be in spaces. But we still know there's discrepancies even within that, right? And so when we think about the pay gap and when we think about Black women on top of that, and we think about all those layering other parts of people's identities, that intersectionality stuff. My thing is with care experience.
But just on that real quickly, because I really want to highlight benefits as we go along. Is that what that has created is public narrative and conversation in public spaces. Like, things have changed for sure since protected characteristics was put in place. But what I'm hearing you say is that, like, it's still not protecting you from discrimination in life in general, but certainly systems have changed, or at least we're... Go on. I was going to say,
at least the system would say that shouldn't happen now. But the reality of day-to-day life is, you know, there's recent
somewhat a mask then, is it? Kind of like...
I always go back to, it's a systems way again. Look, you can have the policy, you can have the system, but it's the people within it, right? And so if you've got poor policies and not very great systems, but brilliant people, you'll see brilliancy coming out, even against some of those really tight restrictions. But if you've got all these policies, but the people within it, their mindset isn't changed in terms of making anything different, it's just a tick box exercise, then what benefits does it give? And how do we ensure that people are, because the whole point is that you're protected. And I think that's such a key word, just like with what is care experience, you are protected. Now,
So what does that mean? So I mean, like, there's a few questions I want to explore, and one of them is like the risks and the benefits. So I suppose let's answer those two spaces by, you know, what does it actually mean, therefore, then, for the care experience community to be protected, you know, in this particular way? Like, what are the pros and cons for you?
I'm just going to be real, Luke. My issue is I was labelled a looked after child and never felt looked after. And so if protected characteristic or being care experience was a protect, I don't understand how I could have been, I say any more protected, not because I was protected to the top, but I wasn't protected. And actually it fails to realise, for me in particular, and for other children and young people and adults with care experience, that actually I am, if not many of these different protected characteristics at very different times in my life, and haven't felt protected because of it. And so I know I've been refused things more so than it's ever been about my care experience. There's things I can't get away from. You know, there's things you will never see my care experience unless I tell you to you, but you'll see my face. You will hear my voice. You will presume my gender based on certain attributes, or, you know, outwardly the way I dress or the way I talk, whatever it might be, right? And so there's already happening.
So there's a risk. And I think, like, even the campaign recognises this risk, which is what's interesting. When I hear the campaign talk, like, they're not clear at all on what impact it's going to have. And they openly say that this actually might cause problems as well, such as, you know, if you therefore disclose that your care experience, that in itself could lead to judgment and discrimination. You know, so you don't necessarily have to share it.
I'm already fighting so many other things I'm trying to hide almost in spaces that aren't always safe for me as a Black woman. Never mind a traumatized child who's now a grown-up Black woman. Never mind, you know, working in social work and having lived experience. So never mind all those things. Yeah, that only in safe spaces would my care experience even be seen as a benefit. Because the reality is, what is care experience? And again, I don't even think we have general national consensus on what care experience is. If you're outside of the sector, what does that mean to you? Because I say I was looked after and people kind of think, And then if I say care experience, people thought I was a young carer. It's just that word that everybody outside of social work, within social work, cool. But the rest of the world exists outside of children's social care.
Look at leaving care, for example. You know, you as a qualified social worker, you know, knows the law, you know, significantly better than I do. You know, I read those laws and I'm kind of like, this sounds very confusing. But, like, you know, I know there's 4 types of care leaver, and depending on, like, you know, so are all 4 of them going to be covered? Like, are we going to have types of, you know?
There'd have to be layers to it. With age, it's age, right? It's naught to the, right? It's age. And so there's no layering to it. We know people can face more discriminations depending on the age and stage they're at, right? But it's age. With care experience as a general term, are we talking about looked after children? I know I already said this, on care leavers. Or are we also considering children who spend some time in care? Are we considering children with disabilities who might spend time in care for respite? Are we considering all the different types that care looks like? And are we only talking about children's social care? Or are we talking about adults who spend time in residential care homes? Like, what are we talking about here in terms of the group?
I'm not sure anybody's clear. So I've searched and I've tried to look for like a really simple way, because I think this stuff needs to become communicated. Because if we're talking about care experience, it transcends age. We're talking about from 0 to whatever. So therefore, the language that we use,
pre-birth assessments that take place.
No, but what I'm saying is that like, the language therefore needs to fit all of these age categories. So I need to be able to explain what a protected characteristic is to somebody that is an infant, protected characteristic as a care experienced person, as an infant, as a toddler, as a teen, as an adult. Like that doesn't exist. And the language itself around this campaign, it's a lot of it's quite heavy. It's quite hard to understand. It's designed for people like that can read that kind of stuff. And it's quite a text heavy. But I suppose what I'm saying is it's not simple. It's not specific. It doesn't say this is what it is. This is who it's for, and this is the impact that it's trying to create. I actually do want to have a conversation about the risks of it. I think it is a conversation that isn't happening, and before I get into it, I think it's really important for me to raise, like, I've actually been advised by people not to talk about protected characteristics because they know that I am somewhat challenging it. And I find that really sad. I find it sad in its most corest form is that I am a care experienced person that is now operating in a place that, just by the nature of the work that I do, is somewhat political. Even though I like to stay apolitical, I like to stay out of this stuff because, my focus is on supporting children's social care in the ways that we do it. But to be advised and to be told by people, like, don't challenge it, it's going to happen, which I believe it is going to happen. I believe that most councils will do it, if not every council. But now I think they're going to do it they're doing it out of pressure and not principle. That's the thing that I'm looking at now. Is this being done because we think it's the right thing to do, or are we doing it now because we're pressured to do it? Which there, for me, then murkies the water of its impact and its reason and all that kind of stuff. But to be told as a care experienced person by people that I respect and people that I know, like, don't engage in the topic, don't talk about it because it comes at reputational risk. I'm willing to communicate about this subject as a care experienced person, wanting to have my view heard. And if my reputation is damaged because of that, then that is such a shame. And in itself, is that not a form of discrimination? Because somebody is challenging something, because I want the best for care experienced people. I want to make sure this is thought through, and I want to share my views on it, because I am concerned, for sure, as many people are, but nobody dares speak up, because if you speak up, therefore you're discriminating. So I think somebody from our care experience community has to stand up and say, okay, let's talk about the risks, let's talk about the challenges. And if I think about it very specifically, if we don't talk about the risks and challenges, which there will be to this and to anything that we do, then we don't develop mitigations. So if we don't know what we're going to do when a risk presents itself, if we don't have a mitigation, we go into chaos, panic, and we flap. And my fear is we make this a protected characteristic, something pops up that's risky, and then we don't know what to do. Then all of a sudden we've got this other problem. So I'm interested in having a conversation about what are some of the potential risks of making care experience a protected characteristic.
I think, look, just to add to what you've just said there is a really good point in terms of when you said, what are the risks? And so let's just go back. Why would people not want to agree to this? Is always where I like to start from, because if anybody presented to me, let's make care experience a protected characteristic, initially I'd be absolutely, because my whole aim has been in all my working career to improve outcomes for children and young people who have experienced care. And so absolutely. But then equally, that questioning would come in, okay, how do we do that? What does it look like? And what are the benefits for children and young people? And so I hope these discussions have been had, and maybe they're just not publicised, so maybe I just don't know they're being had. But on the face of it, why would anybody say no is where I think we need to start from. Well, you wouldn't, right? You wouldn't. You would hear, and I've seen some of the stories that have been shared in councils, terrible outcomes for looked after children. What it tells me is that those people, sometimes in those council spaces, didn't know that was happening in their local area.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
here?
go for it.
Because it's interesting that you're saying that, is that people won't say no, and I somewhat agree. And I think it's worth saying, and I've never mentioned this publicly before, but there was a council whose employment rates for care experienced people were lower than the national average. And we were doing some work with them. And one of my tactics was to essentially support them to, create employment opportunities. That was my objective. And so I went to their lead members meeting. I was invited to talk about this project. And I actually called them to action. I said, I want you to make the motion to make care experience a protected characteristic. And I sat across from the lead member. And so I actually have asked councils to do it. Now, why did I do that? Because I was caught up in the kind of the excitement, the drive of it. And I thought, yeah, this is a great idea. And at that point, I did. I believe that this is going to make a change. And that was because I'd not looked into it. And that's where my mindset changed, is because this council didn't say yes. The person sat across from me said, I don't have enough evidence to warrant this motion. I don't know that discrimination is causing these particular problems.
Right.
It could be something else.
Right.
So go and find me evidence, basically. And that's what changed my mindset. At first, I was like, what? Like,
right.
It wasn't no. It was kind of like, okay, let's go and get some evidence on this. And that's when I started to really look into it. And I was like, hang on a minute. Like, this is quite a serious thing we're asking to do.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've considered it deeply enough.
And that's why I just want to say, unless there are councils or spaces that have had these, and you hope that this would be happening, right? And that's happened and taken place, and there's things, and because look, the thing about, in particular, understanding discrimination is it occurs on so many levels in different spaces, but in different parts of just our country alone. So in the north, groups of people will face disproportionate discrimination very differently to similar groups or people who, let's say, refer to themselves as being a member of one of those groups or characteristics, very differently in the south. And so it can be local and national, both at the same time. And so maybe there are things happening locally that I'm unaware of, that you're unaware of, that for them, this would really work because this is what we plan to do. It's just the sharing of that information, I think, is really key, because some people will have questions. I and you are one of those, or two of those people in particular. But it's the whole understanding. For me, again, it goes back to what, and it's not just about the evidence, it's also about what benefits does this do? Yeah. How are we creating more spaces for care experience to thrive? When are we not just being distracted again from the system? It is in of itself the harmful issue here. It's the policies that already exist that aren't discriminatory but aren't meeting needs. From all the lived experience that care experience young people and adults go on to share.
So to bring that into a risk, and I'm gonna lead a statement here. So I want to. Is what I'm hearing that, because we're focusing on protected characteristic, it is detracting us and distracting us from some other bigger issues at play here, which are around the system. You were saying here that there's there's other things that are causing challenge for young people. And is it then, we're going over here, lots of people are thinking this is the golden bullet that's going to save the day. Yeah. And actually there's much bigger systemic issues over here that are now not having the resource, attention put into, because we're so now focused on this idea that if we make a care experience a protected characteristic, it's going to have an impact.
And it does. It won't. Yeah. And I feel confident in being able to say that based on the outcomes for children and young people who have care experience. I'm just going to use terminology that...
Yeah, just use it. It's a free space.
The outcomes for looked after children and then care leavers. Those poorer outcomes are in relation to housing. Those poorer outcomes are in relation to employment. They're in relation to mental health. They're in relation to resources, access to services. We're talking about here a a part of life for children and young people where they face extreme trauma, where they've witnessed certain things, where they've been excluded from school, all those things. Being protected is not going to stop those things. We are not going to now see looked after children being less likely to be out of education. We are not going to see the attainment gap all of a sudden start closing because that group is protected. Because within that group, you have children who are unaccompanied, you have black children, you have children, Gypsy, Romani, you have children who are on child protection, you have a range of different layers of care experience existing with so many layers of discrimination impacting each of them differently that what we do know is though that the system surrounding children and young people in general from all walks of life, because of resources, because of all these things that are outside of our control. So counsellors can make it a protected characteristic, but it's kind of my thing will be, are you going to put your money where your mouth is then? Are we about to pump back into children's social work and children's social care?
Such powerful points. And the argument then is the issues that young people face because of discrimination or because of a lack of services available. Now, making it a protected characteristic isn't all of a sudden going to inject resource and overwhelm our service to the point where it can actually provide these things that don't exist. And it's quite an interesting space to...
Luke, can I just cut you? I'm sorry, because you just got me thinking, what are we doing about the children and young people that are already disproportionately impacted by being in care? So thinking about black children in care, thinking about their outcomes, on top of being looked after, their outcomes look even poorer because they're black, because they're this. And so all those layering areas of discrimination, how does, for that child or young person, then their care experience becomes protected when they weren't or don't feel protected in the other areas that exist currently? How do we're not protecting them from the discrimination already because our societal systemic policies don't do that. They're not doing that. We're already seeing unconscious biases. We're already seeing policies that purposely impact children and young people, in particular black children and young people. And so if that's already happening, making their care experience protected doesn't change the fact that when black children are reported missing from care, they're automatically assumed gang affiliated or they're not given the same level of notice that other children that are non-black are given. When children are looking at exclusions, why is that group more highly likely to receive an exclusion, permanent or not? Being in care did not prevent support in any way. If anything, it was an extra layer of discrimination. So, I guess my question would be, how do we make sure that those children and young people who should already be protected by the current law that's in place that don't feel protected? And
that's where it just gets tricky. There's these layers, these intersections of protected characteristics where it's like, what you've been discriminated against for now.
Right.
One of the positive things that I think that this campaign presents itself is that we're talking about it. And I think that in itself is important. So I think that they have created quite a lot of public conversation about it.
My caveat would be, though, weren't we already talking about this?
I suppose we were, but I suppose what this is now starting to do is it's starting to leak outside of social care.
Good point.
We're seeing it on the media. We're seeing organisations starting to work in this space.
Councillors in general, you're right.
So I think that just came to me, and I think I really do want to explore this in a balanced way. I do want to try and find benefits because if anything can benefit our children in care, those that have got care experience.
Oh, I'm behind it 150%.
But for this is too a bigger thing to just say, yes, let's do it. And I think from what you've just said, and one of the things that I really think needs to happen is a wider public consultation, which doesn't just communicate with those that have got care experience, but also the people that surround them. So foster carers, social workers,
educators,
teachers, and to start to talk about these quite big topics about how do the layers of, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's care experience, how do these layers of protected characteristics now interplay with each other, and how are we going to differentiate between what is discrimination for protected characteristic of care experience and what is race? Because surely that's diluting then, isn't it? in some way?
I found my own experiences, especially more recently over the last few years, I found that if anything, because of the conversations about lived experience in general, right? Not just care experience. I'm seeing so many more people sharing lived experience of all different types, be it mental health, be it, race, be it religion, be it care, be it, trauma or not, right? I'm seeing lived experiences out there. And so, if anything, for me in my situation, it's been that lived experience has been a huge benefit to me to see in job applications or the person's spec, we are looking for lived experience, and it not be just focused on care experience, just lived experience, and that being celebrated, and not that you have to have been through a trauma in order to, but just lived experience. And that lived experience is so wide because we're talking about direct experience or known and lived, so community level experience. And so for me, that's bringing some phenomenal people forward.
And that's positive discrimination in some format, which is something that the campaign's not talked about at all. Like actually, and I wrote a blog for those that have read it, which talked about a time when I got fired from my employer because something was going on in my life due to my care experience. And I got back to my employer and I bravely told them, I said, look, actually, this is what's going on. This is my situation. And the support that employer gave me was brilliant. My fear is that, we make this a protected characteristic. We talk about, discrimination. We then start to say, well, are employers going to discriminate or do they discriminate? And one of the things I want to just kind of move on to is, and I want to just sort of say something around it as well. I'd like by the end of this podcast was to kind of like think of some things that we'd like to put out into the space for people to consider, being that we're care experience and this is going to impact us too. But councils are now currently saying they're going to treat care experience as if it is a protected characteristic. Do you think that it's possible for them to do that?
I just don't know how. Again, I just go back to that how part, and what we're going to do has not been publicised or celebrated as much as we are another council who has decided to make care experience protected. It's that's great. Now tell us how.
Yeah.
How? Because remember making care experience a protected characteristic is the easy part. Tell me how you're going to prevent discrimination. This is the key part, what we're talking about here. It's not just it's a protected characteristic, therefore that's it, job done. How do you imagine you are going to prevent, because that's the key point of this piece of legislation, prevention. So preventing those groups from discrimination. How are you going to do that? And one of the things I would say to local authorities in particular, or any service, especially now that we're in a space of local authorities now having actions to employ or to find work for looked after children, care leavers, care experienced young people back within their service, how are we going to do that now? How is that going to be done? How are you going to differentiate between two lived experience people?
I've got a few things that I wanted to because again, I've been saying, okay, it's a protected characteristic. Now let's compare it to the other protected characteristics. And it's difficult. So what we do have in place now is people specifically employed to work on diversity and inclusion.
Right.
There's roles within local government in organisations. So for me, I kind of see their role is going to somewhat widen out slightly to include care experience. So an action from making something a protected characteristic has been that organisations have employed people to specifically look in this area.
Focus on.
Yeah. Now, we already have that. So we have a looked after children's nurse or a nurse in the NHS that's specifically there to support care experienced people because we recognise that that's what they need.
Or looked after children.
Looked after children, we'll dance around the line because we know that somebody will be upset by using one word and not the other. We've got the same in education with designated teachers.
Yep.
And the fact that we actually have a state system that is specifically designed to support and enhance the lives of those that have got care experience already there. None of the other protected characteristics had that at the point before it was a protected characteristic.
Absolutely.
So to me, what are we going to do that's different to what we already have?
Right.
Open question.
I don't know, and that's where I'm interested.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know, how do we not once again just overshadow all those people who currently sit under that protected characteristic legislation, who are still struggling, who are still trying to get to the tables to have discussions, who are still fighting for those communities that they belong to and not getting anywhere. And here we go, as you rightfully put forward, that there's a whole group, whilst the outcomes are terrible, we know that, and not for everyone, but for the majority of looked after children, care experienced young people, we know the outcomes aren't great, right? But there are protectors in place. More so, for instance, I had a discussion with my friend just briefly, and I talked about, if you don't understand what life was like for me, I was in care and it was terrible, it was all these things. And they said to me, you were lucky you got to go to care. I had to stay at home. And so that always stuck with me. And it's not to say that my experience of care was great, but it's to say that there's a whole group of children, young people, who don't get some of those protective factors that the care system offers. Well, we know that, right?
But this goes on to an interesting point, because I want us to just wrap up with risks and solutions. But you've just made a really powerful argument about, actually being in care has been protective of maybe situations that were happening at home. One of the things that this campaign is saying is that those that have got care experience, essentially they die earlier because of, that there's been some research that's been shown for that. And for me, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the care experience that's the reason. If I was to analyse that, and if I was to look at it, I would be saying, okay, where does trauma play in that narrative? Because for me, care experienced people have experienced trauma. Right. If you experience trauma, it's a stress. You have stress on your body. It's going to deeply impact your immune system, your health. So is it the care experience, or is it trauma? And lots of people's trauma that they've experienced, not just in care, also at home before care. So for me, that isn't a strong enough argument, because we can't pinpoint that care experience has a bigger mortality rate.
And I think that goes to one of the solutions. What if all organisations where children and young people frequented, families, adults, whomever, were trauma-informed? What if? Because that's more of a doable solution. That's more, because if we think about trauma-informed practice, and we think about the value base and the principles that underline that, we wouldn't need to make care experience a protected characteristic, because that would all be happening. Children and young people and their families and anybody of the community that met with any service will be treated the way that they need to be treated. There'd be no additional add-on. Everybody would be within that. And so for me, the care experience, making it a protected characteristic, only serves, I'm going to say this, a particular group of care experienced young people, because there's a large majority who are care experienced that already fit under these protected characteristics.
Okay, so
protected.
So being trauma informed is one solution. Let's share solutions between us. One of the solutions that I think, or one of the things that I think we need, is a wider consultation with not just those that have got care experience, but those that are associated to it. And the reason why I think that is to mitigate this risk, which is the risk of decision making. And I'm going to use an example with schools. I recognise also that schools, let's be honest, discrimination does happen. Schools will absolutely not let people in because they've got care experience. I know that is absolutely a problem. But there is also a risk that we now are going to lean into. Let's say a young person needs specialist support at school, and we go to a school that doesn't provide specialist support, and we ask the head teacher to let that young person in. And they're now having to juggle in their mind, if I say no, is the finger of discrimination going to be pointed at me? And actually what could also happen is that adult that professional that's asking for that school to give that child a place might also say, well, we think you're discriminating. So therefore the school, or the head teacher, out of fear of being accused of discriminating, lets the child into that placement, lets the child into that school, knowing that that's not the right place for that child because of the fear of being pointed or accused of discrimination. And therefore that is another disruption for that young person, because inevitably it comes to an end. That's why I think we need to communicate with the wider community, because what does this mean for decision making, for social workers, for schools, for foster carers, and anybody around that child? Just
so we're clear for the listeners, in terms of that we do recognise, and it's really difficult, right, when you're making a podcast and you're doing this and it's being filmed and all of that, because we know people can soundbite and take it. And just to really back up what Luke's saying there, we recognise that schools and education do have a criterion list, and actually being looked after is the top of that list almost, right, in terms of getting a place. But even that in and of itself, again, it goes back to there are so many protective factors already in place then, protecting care experience, that actually if you're looked after, you go on the high priority list in terms of getting into a school. If you're, all those things, even when we think about COVID and what took place there, the schools were opened for vulnerable children, and that one of those groups included children in care. And so again, we're protecting. And yes, I get it. It's not protection in the sense of those long-term outcomes are still poor for some. It's not protection in the sense of that being in care is a nice, sunny journey every day of your life. I get that part, but those protective things are in place.
I mean, what's the solution?
Let's talk about it some more.
Let's talk about it more. And because it is, I mean, that's the dynamic is that, I mean, the argument is that they're saying that this is not an extension of corporate parenting, which is essentially what we've just been discussing. I was also going to say that because you're saying talk more, and I think that we need to openly talk about the risks so that when a risk pops up, which it will, we can mitigate against it to prevent this kind of flapping around that happens. I would
just say, because we did start off with, well, why not? Who would say no? So the argument could be, but Karylle and Luke, so what harm does it do? Even if we think about all those risks that you just said, that might happen, it's still happening regardless, right? Does doing it outweigh any negative? Well, I mean, it doesn't cause harm necessarily, but just doing something for the sake of it shouldn't be the thing to do, right?
Well, our young people deserve more
Absolutely.
than us just going, okay, we'll just do it. Good idea. One of the things that I think that it could cause harm, which is a manageable harm, it's microaggression, virtue signaling, for example. You say, oh, I'm care experienced, and someone go, like that unsolicited pity, which we know time and time again our care experience community say that they don't like. There is one other thing there's a few things that I think that we need to do in terms of, and I want to share sort of two more and then pass back to you. On this consultation point, to build on that, I think that councils need to do a bigger consultation with their young people, and I think that this consultation needs reporting and being made publicly accessible, so that we can actually read and see what has been done, because I don't see hardly any of it. And I think there are 4 questions to explore. Number 1, what are the issues that care experienced people face? Out of those issues, which ones are directly linked to discrimination, which is the second question. The third question is, will making care experience a protected characteristic solve that issue? And then the fourth question is, you're going to be left with things after, because there'll be things that won't be related to discrimination. What do we do to solve those problems? And I think what you do there is you then look at the system both from the space of discrimination and also other, and you can make an analysis and an assessment. And so that's what I think needs to done. And the second thing I think is action. Like, if a council is going to make this a protected characteristic, they need to have an action plan. I know, and the public know, of a council who have experienced a housing provider say no care leavers, which to me, likens to that bus that I've mentioned at the start. If you're black, this is where you sit on the bus, you don't sit here. Now, if you've made it a protected characteristic and it's protected in law and you've committed to act in that way, that organisation needs suing. They need striking off your books. And even the campaign have said, I've read some of the campaign material that said something like, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for this. No, under no circumstances whatsoever, when a housing provider writes on an advert, no care leavers, is there a reasonable explanation for that discrimination? So for me, action plans need to be presented forward to say, if we're going to make it a protected characteristic, we're going to say we're going to treat it like a protected characteristic. When this happens, this is what we will do. That's what I think needs to happen.
Look, I agree. I just feel like there's so many parts of the system that we could be improving and spending our time on that I wish councillors were back in, just taking that housing thing. I wish there was more councils that were providing rent up front, that were providing, social housing and secure, good accommodation, because it does exist in some places, and there's at least some accommodations, but that actually we're checking that these accommodations are fit for purpose. And, there's so many other areas of this system that we could be improving and focusing on for looked after children and care leavers, that I just feel that this kind of goes, well, we've made it a protected characteristic. And it's almost we can't do anything with that now, because who's holding those landlords to account? There's things happening, and it's so difficult, isn't it? Because I watched a podcast recently and somebody was talking about unregulated placements, and it's almost like the pot calling the kettle, and it's like, well, hold on, the same local authorities requested we make care experience protected characteristic while simultaneously putting looked after children in unregulated placements. Or, not re-employing young people into the system, or tokenistically setting up children in care councils and not using it. There's so many other things that we could be.
I agree. Yeah. And that's that. I think to kind of, to end on that, like, let's the pot not call the kettle black. Like, you can't give yourself therapy, for example. You have to seek external support for that. But I think that's a great way to sort of bring this podcast to a close, is that I suppose it's great that we're having the conversation about it. It's great that there's a bigger public narrative about it. It's great that it will allow us to be able to implement the law. I mean, the question is, do we actually know how to implement the law? I know if I was discriminated against, I don't know what I would do about that from a legal standpoint, but we don't have time to dig into that.
Luke, just on that, just for our listeners, we ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Do all children know they have rights? So do care experienced young people know they're protected? It's just that whole system of things.
Back to the narrative of the campaign, like, how is it being communicated to all levels? So I want to say that with anything that we do for care experience community, I really deeply hope this is going to make a difference.
100%.
The reason being that I hope it's going to make a difference is because I now believe that every council will probably adopt this. And I said earlier in the podcast, and I believe that this is definitely now an influencing factor of that is pressure, because everybody else is doing it. So given that that's likely to happen, I really do hope it's going to make a difference.
Our workload's about to increase.
Yeah, well, I mean, but that's another interesting thing we didn't talk about. The amount of phone calls I've had saying, there's just been made a protected characteristic, now what do we do?
Right.
And, so... Yeah. And unfortunately, we're too busy. We can't take on any more projects. So, we've got other things. Yeah, Karylle's available. No. Karylle's available. You find her details down below in the captions.
Are you doing that
online? Yeah, down below. It's in the captions.
No, don't contact.
Book her in now. Book her in. I don't know why I'm looking at that camera, because that's directly on you. But anyway, another fist bump for today. Thank you for the podcast. I hope everybody found this useful, and we've definitely gone over on time again.